The December air in Lancaster County is cold enough to silver the townhouse windows. The quiet beginning of the Mirack case. By morning, Christy Mirack's classroom at Rowerstown Elementary was waiting for a teacher who did not arrive. There were ordinary sounds at first: hallway voices, ringing phones, the soft shuffle of concern becoming something more formal. You can imagine the file opening on a desk, its first pages filled with times, names, and careful questions. In 1992, investigators preserved what they could, including biological evidence that science could not yet fully explain. For years, that evidence rested in storage, while detectives returned to interviews, timelines, and the same patient uncertainties. Then, decades later, a family tree, a water bottle, and a piece of chewing gum began to matter. Not loudly, and not all at once, but with the slow clarity of a record being read again. So we begin there, on a quiet winter morning, with a case that waited for the smallest evidence to find its voice. It was Monday, the 21st of December, and the school day was meant to be ordinary. Christy Mirack was 25 years old, a sixth-grade teacher, and by the accounts of people around her, she was reliable. That word matters in a case file, because reliable people create patterns others can notice. When Christy did not arrive at Rowerstown Elementary School, the absence did not drift past as a small delay. It stood out. Colleagues expected her to be there, preparing her room, greeting students, moving through the morning with the rhythm teachers know so well. The first concrete shift came when concern left the hallway and became an action. A call was made, then another. And when there was still no simple answer, someone had to choose what to do next. That choice, small in the moment, moved the case from worry into investigation. The principal, Harry Goodman, went to check on Christy at her home in Greenfield Estates, a townhouse community in East Lampeter Township. You can picture the drive, not as a chase, but as a careful errand no one wanted to make. The roads were familiar, the houses were still. It was the kind of place where parked cars, drawn blinds, and quiet sidewalks could seem perfectly normal until they did not. At Christie's townhouse, the question changed again. She was not simply late. Something serious had happened there, and the first people on scene had to move from human concern into the disciplined habits of evidence. That is one of the hardest turns in any old case. A home is a private place, filled with ordinary things, and suddenly each ordinary thing may have a meaning. A door, a carpet fiber, a telephone, a trace too small to notice without training. The people who entered that space had to be careful, because the scene was now the beginning of a record. The decision was not only to look, but to preserve. In 1992, that meant photographs, notes, collected items, and the patient labeling of evidence that might not make sense for years. It also meant accepting the limits of the time. The investigators could gather biological evidence, and they could understand that it was important, but they could not yet ask it all the questions later scientists would learn to ask. That gap is one of the quiet centers of the Mirack case. The clue was there early, the power to fully use it was not. If you are reading the first pages of the file, you notice how quickly a school morning becomes a timeline. Christy was expected at Rowerstown Elementary. She did not arrive. People tried to reach her. A welfare check followed. Police became involved. Each line is simple, but together they mark the crossing from routine into uncertainty. The date, the 21st of December, sits at the top of everything like a pin in a map. It was close to Christmas break, when classrooms often carry a softer mood. There might have been projects finishing, students restless with holiday energy, teachers balancing lessons with the end of the term. Christie's room would have held the signs of that season: papers, books, plans for the day. A teacher's desk is rarely empty of intention. That is part of why the absence hurt so sharply. It interrupted a life that had visible shape. Investigators began where investigators often begin, with the people closest to the victim. They looked at relationships, routines, recent contacts, and the ordinary movements of the days before. They asked who had seen Christy. They asked when. They asked whether anyone had noticed anything unusual near Greenfield Estates. This kind of work can sound simple from far away, but it requires patience from the first hour. A person's life is not one line. It is a weave of friends, family, co-workers, neighbors, errands, plans, and habits. To understand the final known hours, Detectives had to move through that weave without pulling too hard in the wrong direction. They had to ask personal questions gently. They had to hear grief and confusion and still write down times. They had to separate memory from assumption. That is difficult work, especially when everyone wants an answer quickly. A new development came from the scene itself. Investigators found evidence that suggested the person responsible had left behind biological material. In today's world, that detail may seem instantly decisive. We are used to hearing that DNA can name a person, connect a case, or clear someone who has been under suspicion for years. But in 1992, forensic DNA was still developing. It was not the fast searchable tool it would later become. Testing could compare known people to a sample. It could help include or exclude. But it could not, by itself, turn an unknown profile into a name from a distant family tree. That mattered. It meant the evidence could speak only in limited ways. It could say, this person is not the source. It could say, this person may be consistent. But it could not yet say, here is a stranger's identity found through relatives who uploaded genealogy information decades later. So, detectives did what they could. They collected, they documented, they stored, they kept going. The early investigation moved outward from Christie's townhouse, but it also kept circling back to that preserved evidence. That is the rhythm of many cold cases before they become cold. There is motion at first. Calls come in, interviews are scheduled. Tips are logged. People remember a vehicle, a sound, a conversation, a small discomfort they did not understand at the time. Each tip has to be treated with respect, because one small recollection can matter. But each tip also has to be tested. Was the person really there that morning? Was the time correct? Could the detail have come from news coverage? Did it fit the physical evidence? This is where the work becomes less like a single revelation and more like sorting grains of sand. Slowly, carefully, without assuming the bright piece is the true piece. In Lancaster County, the case drew deep attention. Christy was young. She was a teacher. Her absence had been noticed by children and colleagues before the wider public knew anything. That gives a case a particular kind of ache. The loss is not abstract. It is connected to a classroom, to rows of desks, to a school building where people still had to move through the day. The investigators had to carry that human weight while keeping their notes plain. Names, times, addresses, statements, evidence numbers. The plainness of police paperwork can seem cold, but it is often the way care survives pressure. A good note preserves what memory may later blur. A sealed item preserves what science may later understand. A careful question preserves the chance that someone, years later, can return to the beginning and see it clearly. That is what happened here, though not quickly. Not in a way anyone could have planned. The case began with urgency, but its most important clue would need time. A lot of time. When you sit with an old case long enough, you begin to notice the difference between an unanswered question and a forgotten one. The Mirack case was unanswered. It was not forgotten. That distinction matters. From the beginning, investigators had evidence, but they also had a problem. The unknown person suggested by the biological material did not immediately become a known suspect. That created a difficult space. It was not empty. It was full of work. Detectives could interview people in Christie's life. They could examine possible motives. They could compare samples when available. They could follow leads from the public. But when those paths did not produce a final answer, the evidence remained there, waiting. A case can wait in more than one way. It can wait in a filing cabinet, with typed reports and handwritten notes. It can wait in an evidence room, sealed and labeled. It can wait in the mind of an investigator driving home at night, replaying the same few facts. It can wait in a family's yearly calendar where anniversaries return whether the case moves or not. In December of 1992, no one could know that the answer would depend on methods still beyond the horizon. No one could know that someday a genealogist might study distant relatives and public records to point toward a man who had lived in the same broad community. No one could know that discarded items, a water bottle and chewing gum, would become part of the final chain. So the first decision was the most basic one. Keep the evidence safe. That decision can sound almost passive. It is not. Preservation is an active form of hope. It says, we may not understand this fully today, but we will not destroy tomorrow's chance. That was especially important in the Mirack case, because biological evidence can be fragile. It depends on collection, packaging, storage, and documentation. If a link in that chain is careless, the future loses options. If the chain holds, the future may gain a voice. Here, the chain held long enough, and that is one reason this case is remembered in the history of genetic genealogy. Not because the answer came easily, because someone kept the door open. In the early days, investigators also had to build a picture of Christy as a person, not only as the center of a case. She had grown up in Pennsylvania and had made a life around teaching. By the time she was working at Rowerstown Elementary, she was part of a community that understood her through daily contact. Students knew her as the adult at the front of the classroom. Colleagues knew her habits, her schedule, her way of being in the building. Family and friends knew a fuller life, with hopes and plans beyond work. A careful investigation has to honor all of that. It cannot reduce a person to a timeline. But it also needs the timeline. So detectives asked ordinary questions that may have felt painful. What did she do the night before? Who spoke with her last? Was anything different? Was anyone expected at the townhouse? Did she mention a worry, a plan, a visitor, a call? These questions were not asked because investigators wanted to intrude. They were asked because life leaves traces in routine. A changed routine can matter. A familiar visitor can matter. A missed call can matter. A neighbor's memory can matter. And sometimes, after all of that, the most honest answer remains, we do not know yet. That answer is hard for everyone. For families, it can feel like a second burden. For investigators, it can become the weight they carry into the next interview. For a community, it can leave a quiet unease in places that once felt simple. But the work continues because the alternative is to let the unknown harden into silence. In Lancaster County, the silence did not harden completely. The file stayed open, the evidence stayed preserved, and the unknown profile stayed important. There is a certain kind of patience in forensic work that people do not always see. It is not dramatic. It does not look like a sudden confrontation or a last-minute confession. It looks like forms, labels, temperature records, evidence logs, requests for testing. Lab reports read line by line. In the Mirack case, physical evidence from 1992 became the quiet center of the future investigation. At first, the available science could help only so much. Early DNA methods required more material and offered fewer pathways. Databases were smaller. The idea of using public genealogy information to find distant relatives was not part of routine criminal investigation. So detectives were left with a strange condition. They had something highly meaningful, and yet it could not finish the work. That is one of the most human frustrations in cold cases. To know that an answer may be close, but not reachable. To hold a key before the right lock has been made. The investigators did not simply sit still. They followed leads as they came. They reviewed possible connections. They compared information. They returned to the old questions when new details arrived. Still, as months became years, the case changed shape. The first wave of urgency softened into endurance. The file grew older. People moved jobs. Some witnesses became harder to locate. Memories settled, shifted, or faded around the edges. But evidence, if preserved well, can remain more stable than memory. That is why the items collected in 1992 mattered so much. They did not need to remember. They only needed to remain. Imagine now that you are the detective assigned to review the early file. Not on the first day. Years later, you sit at a desk with boxes nearby, and you begin again. The first choice is where to enter the story. You can start with the scene. You can start with Christy's schedule. You can start with interviews. Or you can start with the evidence list, because that is where the future may be hiding. You choose the evidence list. It is not a dramatic choice. It is a patient one. You read the labels. You check the chain of custody. You look at which items were tested, which were not, and which might be tested again under newer methods. This is how old cases move. A person decides to look again, not because there is a guarantee, because there is a possibility. And possibility in cold casework is enough to open the box. The Mirack case would eventually benefit from that kind of looking again. Improved DNA testing made it possible to develop a clearer genetic profile from the preserved material. That was a significant development. It meant the evidence could speak more clearly than before. But even then, the answer did not arrive all at once. A profile is not always a name. A strong profile can be searched in law enforcement databases, but if the source has never been entered, there may be no match. That is what made the case continue to wait. The science had improved. The clue had sharpened, but the door had not opened. So the next part of the work became quieter and in some ways more difficult. A detective can have a profile that is clear, useful, and carefully developed, and still have no person standing behind it. That is a strange kind of progress. It is progress you can measure in the lab, but not yet in the interview room. The report can say that an unknown male profile exists. It can say that certain people are excluded. It can narrow the field by science, not by guesswork. But if the person is not in the database has nothing more to give. In those years, the National DNA Index was becoming a more powerful tool. More profiles were added as laws changed, as convictions were recorded, and as forensic testing became more common. Investigators could hope that one day, the unknown profile from Christy Mirack's case might match someone already entered. That hope was reasonable. It had happened in other cases. A profile would sit for years, then one day a notification would arrive. A hit, a name, a place to begin again. But in the Mirack investigation, that kind of answer did not come for a long time. The profile remained valuable, but unnamed. It was like having a clear fingerprint from a person whose prints were stored nowhere. The evidence had identity inside it. The system just had no mirror. This is where a case can feel almost still from the outside. There may be no new press conference, no new search, no obvious movement, but inside the file, there can be small motions that matter. A detective calls a former witness again. A lab is asked about new testing, a report is copied, a box is pulled from storage and returned to a desk. Names from the early 1990s are reviewed with older eyes. Some names are crossed out more firmly. Some questions are written again in the margin. The same facts are arranged in a new order, just to see if they make a different shape. Cold case work often looks like that. It is less about force and more about return. If you imagine yourself in that evidence room, the air is not dramatic. It is controlled. It is practical. There are shelves, labels, sealed packages, forms, initials, dates, and rules. A person may stand there with a clipboard, checking that each item is where the record says it should be. That simple match between paper and object is part of justice. The item exists, the label is intact, the chain remains readable. Years can pass, and the record can still be followed. That is not an accident. It comes from clerks, officers, technicians, and investigators doing careful work when no one is watching. The Mirack case depended on that kind of quiet reliability. The case had begun with Christie's reliability being noticed. Then, over time, the investigation itself had to become reliable. Evidence can be lost in many ways. It can be misplaced, it can be damaged, it can be consumed by early testing, it can be stored in conditions that make later testing harder. It can be documented in a way that leaves questions. So when old biological evidence remains useful after more than 2 decades, that fact deserves attention. It means the case was cared for, not solved yet, not complete, but cared for, and care, in a cold case, is not a sentimental word. It is a working condition. It means someone left the future a chance. The early investigators in Lancaster County could not know the exact future of forensic science. They did not know that ordinary people would one day build public family trees online. They did not know that distant cousin matches could guide a criminal investigation. They did not know that a person's discarded water bottle might later confirm what a family tree suggested. But they did know that the evidence mattered, so they preserved it. That decision, repeated in small, practical ways, became the bridge between 1992 and 2018. It was not a bridge anyone could see at first. It was built out of labels, sealed envelopes, lab work, and patience. As the years moved on, the case also lived in memory. It lived in the school community. It lived with people who had worked beside Christy. It lived with her family, who had to carry private grief through public uncertainty. It lived with investigators who understood that an unanswered case can become part of a place. Not every person in Lancaster County followed every detail. Life went on as life does. Children grew older, teachers changed classrooms. New families moved into neighborhoods that had once known every headline. But the Mirack case remained part of the local record. It was one of those names people remembered. A young teacher, a winter morning, a case still waiting. For investigators, time changes the work in practical ways. People move, phone numbers change, memories become less exact. Some witnesses become more willing to speak after years. Others remember less than they wish they did. Documents become more important because documents do not age in quite the same way. A statement written close to the event can preserve a detail that no one could recall later. A lab report can hold a fact steady. A property receipt can show where an item went. A case note can tell a later detective why an early decision was made. This is why old files matter. They are not just paper, they are stored attention. When the Mirack file was reviewed over the years, investigators were not only looking for new evidence, they were also looking for new meaning in old evidence. That is an important difference. A cold case may not receive a fresh clue from the outside. No new witness may appear, no confession may arrive. No forgotten diary may be found, but a new method can turn an old item into something new. The item itself has not changed. The question has changed. The ability to compare has changed, and sometimes that is enough. In the years after 1992, forensic DNA testing became more sensitive. Smaller samples could be used, profiles could be developed with more precision. The language of the lab became more detailed. Investigators learned to ask whether preserved material could be retested or tested in a new way. This did not mean every old case could suddenly be solved. Many could not. Some evidence had degraded, some samples were too limited, some profiles were mixed or incomplete, some cases had no biological evidence at all. But where a strong profile existed, a new possibility remained alive. The Mirack case had that possibility. It had a profile that mattered. It had no match. Those two facts sat together for years. There is a quiet frustration in that pairing. Strong evidence. No name. It is like reading a letter with the signature torn away. You understand the letter came from someone real. You can study the handwriting, the paper, the ink, the path it took through the mail. But the final line is missing. The name is absent. And without the name, every next step is harder. Investigators could not arrest a profile. They could not interview a profile. They could not ask where it had been on the morning of the 21st of December. They needed a person. For many years, they did not have one. So, the case entered the long middle. This is the part of a cold case that rarely receives much attention, but it may be the most human part. The first days are full of action. The final days of a case is solved are full of public recognition. But the middle is made of waiting. It is made of returning. It is made of people doing their work without knowing whether it will ever produce an answer. In that middle, a case can test the patience of everyone connected to it. Families want resolution. Investigators want proof. The public wants to understand. The evidence waits without urgency. It does not comfort anyone. It simply remains. You can imagine a detective years later, sitting with the Mirack file after normal office hours. The building has gone quiet. The overhead lights are too bright in one corner, too dim in another. There is coffee cooling nearby. There are folders open on the desk. The detective reads the first responding reports again, then the interviews, then the lab summaries, then the lists of people considered, contacted, excluded, or still uncertain. This is not glamorous work. It is careful work. It asks for a kind of humility, because the detective knows that earlier investigators may have done everything they could with the tools they had. The question is not, why did they miss it? The question is, what can we see now that they could not see then? That question is central to the Mirack case. It is also central to many older cases solved through DNA. Time can hide information, but time can also reveal it. A sample preserved in 1992 may become more useful in 2002, more useful again in 2010, more useful again in 2018. The same physical trace can pass through several eras of science. Each era asks a little more. Each era hears a little more. And sometimes, after a very long silence, the answer begins to take form. Before genetic genealogy entered the case, investigators still had traditional paths. They could compare known samples from people connected to Christie. They could revisit suspects. They could examine whether anyone had made statements over the years that deserved another look. They could review old alibis, old timelines, and old assumptions. They could ask whether the unknown profile fit any person already considered. This kind of work is necessary. It keeps the investigation grounded. A new science does not replace ordinary detective work. It rests on top of it. If the old groundwork is weak, the new lead can wobble. In the Mirack case, the preserved evidence and the accumulated file gave later investigators something solid to stand on. At some point, improved testing gave the case a clearer genetic profile. That development did not solve the case by itself, but it changed the quality of the unknown. The unknown was no longer vague. It had a defined biological signature. It could be compared, it could exclude, it could wait inside a database, it could eventually be converted into a form useful for genealogy research. Each of those steps required choices. Someone had to request the testing. Someone had to evaluate the result. Someone had to decide the case was still worth pushing forward. The answer did not rise from the evidence on its own. People kept asking. That is one reason cold cases are often solved by teams rather than by one dramatic figure. There may be a detective whose name appears in articles. There may be a prosecutor who presents the case. There may be a genealogist whose work narrows the search. There may be a lab technician whose testing makes comparison possible. But behind them are many earlier hands. The officer who sealed an item correctly. The clerk who stored the report. The supervisor who approved another round of testing. The witness who agreed to answer questions again. The family member who kept faith with the process. In old cases, answers are often collective. They arrive through the patience of many people, spread across many years. By the time the Mirack case reached the 2010s, the world around DNA had changed in ways few people could have predicted. People were using consumer genealogy services to learn about family history. They were building trees online. They were comparing distant relatives. They were discovering unknown cousins, old migrations, maiden names, and branches of families that had been quiet for generations. Most of that activity was personal. It was about ancestry. It was about curiosity. It was about belonging. But investigators began to understand that these same tools might help identify unknown people in criminal cases. Not always, not easily, not without ethical questions, but sometimes, with care, the method could provide a direction where standard databases had provided none. The basic idea was simple enough to say, though hard to do. An unknown DNA profile could be compared against public genealogy data. If the unknown person had relatives in that data, even distant ones, those relatives might appear as partial matches, a second cousin, a third cousin, a more distant branch. From there, genealogists could begin building family trees. They would work backward to common ancestors, then forward again through descendants. They would use birth records, marriage records, obituaries, census records, address histories, and public documents. Slowly, the shape of a family would emerge. The unknown profile would not say a name directly. It would say, "Look somewhere in this family line." Then investigators and genealogists would narrow the field. It sounds almost gentle when described this way, like archival work in a library. In practice, it required great discipline. Family trees can be complicated, records can be wrong, names change, people are adopted, families move. Some relationships are not written down, some branches are missing. Some public trees contain errors copied from other trees. A genealogist has to move carefully, checking one record against another. A possible connection is not proof. A promising branch is not an accusation. A name on a chart is only a place to look. That distinction would matter very much in the Mirack case. In 2018, forensic genetic genealogy was becoming widely known because of several long unsolved cases. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo in the Golden State Killer investigation brought enormous attention to the method. That case showed many investigators that preserved evidence, combined with genealogy, could change what was possible. Across the country, cold case units began looking at old files differently. They asked which cases had suitable DNA. They asked whether a profile could be uploaded or converted for genealogy comparison. They asked whether the old waiting period might finally be ending. The Mirack case was one of the cases ready for that moment. It had evidence. It had a profile. It had years of unanswered work behind it. Lancaster County investigators turned toward forensic genetic genealogy in 2018. The decision was not a small one. It meant moving beyond the standard law enforcement database. It meant using a newer method that required both technical skill and careful interpretation. It meant treating the genetic profile not as an immediate identity, but as a clue to kinship. A family tree would have to be built. Public records would have to be checked. People who had no involvement in the crime might appear in the research simply because they shared ancestry. That required discretion. It required patience. It required remembering that genealogy leads are sensitive. They point through families, not just individuals. The preserved Mirack profile was submitted for analysis. From there, the work moved into a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of the evidence room. Not the quiet of a detective's desk. This was the quiet of records, names in databases, dates of birth, marriage certificates, old addresses, newspapers, family lines running backward through parents and grandparents, then forward again through children and cousins. The work was not a chase. It was a map being drawn slowly. Each line had to be checked. Each branch had to be tested against time, place, age, and possibility. If you were sitting beside the genealogist, you might not feel that anything dramatic was happening. A cursor moves across a screen. A name is entered. A document opens. A birth date is compared with another birth date. An address is noted. A possible ancestor becomes a confirmed ancestor or falls away. The work is repetitive. It is calm. It is exacting. And slowly, if the records allow it, the unknown person's family context begins to appear. Not the person yet. The context, that is an important step. Before a name, there is often a family line. Before a suspect, there is a cluster of possibilities. Before proof, there is direction. In the Mirack case, the genealogy research began to guide investigators toward family connections. This was the turning point, but not the finish. After more than 25 years, the case had moved from a nameless DNA profile to a possible lineage. That changed the work. Detectives could stop waiting for a direct database hit that might never come. They could begin evaluating a smaller universe of people. Who in this family structure was the right age? Who had a connection to Lancaster County? Who could have been near East Lampeter Township in December of 1992? Who fit the biological profile? Who could be investigated without assuming more than the evidence allowed? The family tree did not answer those questions by itself. It made them possible. This is where the method becomes both powerful and delicate. A genealogy lead can feel persuasive because it emerges from science. But the lead is not the same as the final comparison. It is a pointer. It says, search here. It says, this family branch may contain the unknown person. It does not say this person is guilty. For that, investigators needed direct evidence. They needed a sample from a specific person, compared to the profile from the Mirack case. Until that happened, the genealogy work remained a lead, a meaningful lead, a rare lead, but still a lead. The genealogical narrowing eventually drew attention toward Raymond Charles Rowe. He was known in the Lancaster area as DJ Freeze. He worked as a disc jockey for weddings, school events, and community gatherings. His public identity was not hidden. He was a local figure in a very ordinary way. People hired him to play music. People saw him at celebrations. He appeared in the background of happy memories that had nothing to do with the Mirack investigation. That contrast is one of the difficult parts of solved cold cases. A person can be known for one set of public reasons, while a different question waits quietly in an old file. That is why investigators had to move carefully. A genealogy chart had led them toward Rowe, but it had not completed the case. It gave them a direction, and direction is not the same thing as proof. Rowe was born in the late 1960s, which made him a young adult at the time of Christy Mirack's death. He had ties to the Lancaster area. He was familiar to people through events, music, and local gatherings. Those facts did not prove anything by themselves. They only made him a person who could be examined more closely. In a cold case, narrowing the field can feel like progress, but it also creates a new responsibility. Investigators have to be exact. They have to test the lead without leaning on it too heavily. They have to ask whether the science points to one person or only to a family line near that person. They have to remember that a family tree is built from public records, and public records need confirmation, so the work moved from genealogy back into traditional investigation. Detectives looked at Rowe's age. They looked at his location. They looked at his background. They looked at whether the known facts of his life could fit the unknown facts of the case. None of this had the feeling of a sudden moment. It was closer to measuring. A line is drawn, then checked, then drawn again. The next step was the one that mattered most. Investigators needed a direct DNA comparison. They needed to know whether Raymond Rowe's genetic profile matched the preserved biological evidence from 1992. Until that comparison existed, the case remained in the careful space between possibility and certainty. That space is where patient investigators must be most disciplined. They could not simply ask the old evidence to finish the story through a chart. They needed a sample from Rowe himself. There are different ways investigators can seek such a sample. Sometimes they ask directly. Sometimes they obtain a warrant. Sometimes, if an item has been discarded in a public way, they collect it for testing. In this case, the evidence that helped move the investigation forward was ordinary. A water bottle, a piece of chewing gum, small things, forgettable things, objects that pass through a day without anyone expecting them to become important. That is the detail people often remember about the Mirack case. Not because it is loud, because it is strange in its simplicity. After more than 25 years, the comparison sample came from items someone had used and left behind. A bottle that held water, gum that had been chewed, the kind of items that usually end in a trash bag and then disappear. But to investigators, they were not trash in that moment. They were possible evidence. They could carry cells. They could carry a profile. They could answer whether the man suggested by genealogy was also the man suggested by the evidence collected in Christie's home. This was not a large, dramatic object. It was not something anyone would place in a display case. It was practical. It was quiet. And it mattered. You can imagine the care required in collecting it. A detective does not simply pick up an item and say the case is solved. There are gloves. There are bags. There are labels. There are notes about time and place. There is a chain of custody. There is a lab request. There is waiting. Always, there is waiting. The items connected to Rowe were sent for forensic testing. The lab work had one central question. Did the DNA from the discarded items match the unknown profile preserved from the Mirack case? It is a plain question, but a heavy one. For years, the unknown profile had been waiting without a name. Now, for the first time, investigators had a specific person to compare. Testing does not move at the speed of emotion. It moves through procedure. A sample is processed. A profile is developed. Quality is checked. Comparison is made. A report is prepared. People outside the lab may feel impatience, but the lab has to remain slow enough to be right. That patience is part of why forensic evidence can carry weight in court. The result is not just a feeling. It is a documented process. It is science placed inside a record. And in an old case, where memories may have softened, the record becomes especially important. When the comparison was made, investigators concluded that Rowe's DNA matched the long-preserved profile from the Mirack case. The genealogy lead had pointed in his direction. The discarded items had provided a direct comparison. The old evidence, held since 1992, now had a name attached to it. That was the moment the case changed from an unanswered file into a criminal case moving toward arrest. Even here, it helps to keep the tone gentle. There is no need to make the moment larger than it already is. A match after 25 years is already significant. It is significant because of the years. It is significant because of the evidence. It is significant because people kept returning to a question that had not gone away. For the detectives, the result would have rearranged the file. Names once marked as possible could be understood differently. Old interviews could be read with a new lens. The timeline could be checked again. The history of the investigation could be prepared for prosecutors. A scientific result does not end the work. It begins a new kind of work. The case now had to move from the quiet of the lab into the public system. That meant warrants, charges, court documents, statements from officials. It meant that a private investigation, held for decades by family and police, would return to public attention. The people who remembered Christy would hear the news again, but now with the name Raymond Charles Rowe was arrested in June of 2018. At the time, he was known publicly in Lancaster County as DJ Freeze. The arrest brought the Mirack case back into local and national reporting. It also placed the case within a wider conversation about forensic genetic genealogy. For Lancaster County, this was not an abstract development. It was local. It was a teacher. It was a school. It was a December morning many people had never forgotten. The announcement did not erase the years in between. It gathered them into one public moment. You can imagine a person hearing the news in 2018. Maybe a former student. Maybe a teacher who had worked at Rowerstown Elementary. Maybe a neighbor who remembered police cars in Greenfield Estates. Maybe someone who had seen the case mentioned year after year without an answer. The name arrives, and with it comes a strange feeling. Not simple relief. Not closure in the easy sense. Something more mixed. A door opens, but it opens onto an old room. That is often how solved cold cases feel. They answer one central question, but they do not return time. They do not restore the ordinary morning that was lost. They do not remove the long uncertainty from the people who lived with it. They give the record a name. They give prosecutors a path. They give family and community a formal answer. Those things matter deeply. But they arrive carrying the weight of all the years before them. The investigative chain in the Mirack case had become clear. Evidence was collected in 1992. That evidence was preserved. DNA testing improved. A profile was developed. Traditional database searches did not produce the answer. Forensic genetic genealogy offered a new direction. The genealogy work pointed toward Rowe. Discarded items provided a comparison sample. The comparison supported the conclusion that Rowe was the source of the unknown profile. Each link depended on the one before it. If the evidence had not been preserved, genealogy could not have helped. If the profile had not been suitable, the family tree could not have opened. If the genealogy lead had not been treated carefully, investigators might not have known where to look. If the discarded items had not been tested, a lead might have remained only a lead. The solution was not one trick, it was a sequence. A long, patient sequence. That is what makes the title of this case feel so fitting. The weird evidence was not weird because it was mysterious in itself. It was weird because it was so ordinary. A water bottle, chewing gum, things used and forgotten, things made to be thrown away, and yet, in the right context, with the right lab work, they became part of a bridge between two distant years. 1992 on one side, 2018 on the other. Between them, a case file. Between them, an evidence room. Between them, many investigators who could not see the final answer, but kept the materials safe enough for someone else to find it. There is a lesson in that, but it is a quiet one. Cold case work often depends on respecting the future. An investigator in the present does not know what technology will exist later. They do not know what a later detective will need. They do not know which tiny trace will become important. So they preserve more carefully than the moment may seem to require. They write more clearly. They label more carefully. They resist the temptation to decide that an unanswered item has no value. The Mirack case shows how that restraint can matter. The biological evidence did not disappear. The file did not vanish. The unanswered profile did not become meaningless simply because it had no match. It waited. And when a new method appeared, the evidence was ready. The public announcement in 2018 also required explanation. For many people, genetic genealogy was still new. They understood DNA testing in a general way. They may have heard of criminal databases. They may have known that DNA could compare a suspect to crime scene evidence. But genealogy was different. It did not begin with a direct suspect. It began with relatives. often distant relatives, people who had never heard of the case and had no connection to it except shared ancestry. That made the method both powerful and unsettling. It could solve old cases, it could identify unknown remains, it could clear people who had lived under suspicion, but it also used family connections in ways many ordinary users had not imagined when they uploaded their information. In the Mirack case, the method brought an answer after decades. At the same time, it became part of a larger discussion about privacy, consent, and public data. A calm retelling has room for both truths. The technique helped solve the case. The technique also raised questions that investigators, courts, companies, and communities would need to consider. Those truths do not cancel each other. They sit together. Like many things in old investigations, they ask for care rather than simple answers. For the detectives working the case, though, the immediate task in 2018 was not philosophical. It was practical. They had to prepare the case for prosecution. They had to document the evidence chain. They had to explain the genealogy lead without overstating it. They had to show how the discarded items connected Roe directly to the preserved profile. They had to make sure every step could be read, challenged, and understood in court. Court is not the same as investigation. An investigation asks, where should we look? A courtroom asks, what can be proven? The difference matters. Detectives may follow intuition, leads, patterns, and partial information, but prosecutors need admissible evidence. They need reports. They need witnesses. They need lab results. They need a chain that a judge and jury can examine. The Mirack case had crossed into that second world. The file was no longer only a record of questions. It was becoming a record of proof. For Christy Mirack's family, the arrest reopened the case in a deeply personal way. The world saw a headline. They had lived the years. They had known the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days when the absence was present. They had known what it meant to wait without knowing whether anyone would ever be charged. When a cold case arrest happens, people sometimes use the word closure. It is a useful word, but it can be too small. Closure can sound like a door shutting neatly. For many families, the experience is not neat. It may bring relief, grief, anger, exhaustion, and memory all at once. The answer arrives, and it asks the heart to revisit the beginning. Christy's colleagues and former students also carried memories. A teacher's life leaves many small marks, lessons taught, encouragement given, a classroom atmosphere, a child's memory of being seen. These things do not appear in forensic reports, but they are part of why the case mattered. The official record needed dates, evidence, and legal language. The human record held something else. A young teacher who should have had more mornings. A school that noticed she was missing because she was expected. A community that kept her name. That distinction is important. The case is called the Mirack case because the legal system needs names for files. But Christy Mirack was not a case. She was a person. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a teacher, a colleague. The investigation existed because her life had value. In old casework, it is easy for the evidence to become the center of attention. The bottle, the gum, the genealogy chart, the DNA profile. Those details are important, and they explain how the case moved. But they matter because they led back to a person. They matter because they helped answer what happened to Christy. They matter because they gave the court a way to speak after a long silence. The arrest of Roe also affected people who knew him. That is another quiet complexity in cold cases. A person may be familiar to a community under one identity: a performer, a co-worker, a neighbor, a business owner, someone present at weddings and school events. Then an old investigation places that person in a very different public light. For people who had hired him or known him casually, the news may have felt unreal. They may have searched memory for signs. They may have wondered what they had missed. But most daily life does not reveal the hidden parts of people. It moves on surfaces, schedules, greetings, music at an event, a handshake, a name on a flyer. The investigation did not depend on people having noticed something decades earlier. It depended on evidence. That is part of what makes forensic cold case work so important. It can reach beyond memory. It can reach beyond reputation. It can ask a question that does not depend on whether someone seemed ordinary. Ordinary appearances can mislead in every direction. A person may appear unusual and be innocent. A person may appear familiar and be responsible. This is why careful investigation resists shortcuts. It does not solve a case by personality. It solves a case by evidence, context, and proof. The Mirack case had now become an example of that principle. For years, there had been no public indication that Rowe would become the named defendant. He was not the figure around whom the early case seemed to revolve. His name emerged because a new method connected family data to preserved evidence. Then direct testing connected him to the profile. The route was indirect, but the final comparison was direct. This difference matters when explaining genetic genealogy to a calm listener. Genealogy did not convict Rowe. It identified a lead. The discarded water bottle and gum helped provide a comparison sample. The comparison to the 1992 evidence became central. Then the legal process took over. Each stage had its own standard. Genealogy asks who might be related. Investigation asks who fits the facts. Forensic testing asks whether the DNA matches. Court asks whether the evidence proves the charge. When those stages are kept separate, the method is easier to understand. There is also patience inside the word match. In casual speech, it sounds simple. The profiles matched. But in the lab, a match is built from many points of comparison. It is evaluated. It is checked. It is described in a report. The people doing that work know the consequence of their words. They do not write lightly. The report had to be able to travel from the laboratory to the courtroom and still remain clear. It had to explain what was tested, how it was tested, and why the comparison mattered. For investigators, that report became one more careful page in a file already full of waiting. When Raymond Rowe was taken into custody in June of 2018, the arrest did not stand alone. It stood on the preserved evidence from 1992. It stood on the genetic profile that had waited without a name. It stood on the genealogy work that had narrowed the field. And it stood on the discarded items, quiet and ordinary, that gave investigators a direct comparison. That is the chain you can trace if you imagine the files spread across a long table. At one end, there is the first day, the 21st of December, 1992. At the other end, there is the arrest, more than 25 years later. Between them, there are reports, lab requests, evidence logs, family trees, warrants, and careful decisions. Nothing in that chain works by itself. Each piece needs the others. In public reporting, a solved cold case can sometimes sound sudden. A headline appears. A name is announced. A photograph is shown. But inside the case, the moment has been built slowly, one verified fact at a time. The announcement in Lancaster County brought many people back to the beginning. It brought them back to Christy Mirack's classroom. It brought them back to Greenfield Estates. It brought them back to a winter morning that had never fully left the community. For some, the case had been a remembered headline. For others, it had been part of their own lives. A teacher they had known, a colleague they had missed, a family member whose absence shaped every year after. The arrest also introduced the wider public to a method that was still new enough to feel unfamiliar. Forensic genetic genealogy had already begun changing old investigations, but many people were still learning how it worked. It was not the same as a traditional criminal database search. It did not simply look for a person whose DNA was already in law enforcement records. Instead, it searched for relatives, sometimes distant ones, and then asked genealogists to build a path from those relatives toward the unknown person. In the Mirack case, that path did not end in the laboratory alone. It had to be checked against real life, age, location, family connections, possible access to Lancaster County, a person who could have been there at that time, in that place. Only after that narrowing did the discarded water bottle and gum become important. The water bottle and gum were not the reason the case began to move. They were the reason the lead could be tested. That distinction is small, but it is important. Genealogy pointed. The discarded items compared. The preserved evidence connected. The court record then had to carry all of that in language that could be examined. When officials described the case after the arrest, they emphasized the long road. They spoke about the evidence preserved from the original investigation. They spoke about advanced DNA technology. They spoke about the sample collected from items associated with Roe. The story was unusual, but its structure was simple. Old evidence met new science. New science created a lead. A direct comparison turned that lead into proof strong enough for charges. Charges are a different kind of document. They do not move like family trees. They do not move like lab reports. They are formal, narrow, and exact. They describe what the state believes it can prove. They turn an investigation into a case before the court. For Roe, the arrest meant that the old Mirack file entered the legal system under his name. The court process had its own pace. Hearings had to be scheduled. Attorneys had to review evidence. Prosecutors had to prepare. The defense had to examine the case against him. Nothing moved with the private rhythm of a cold case anymore. Now it moved by court calendar, motion, filing, and hearing. This is another place where patience changes form. In the investigation, patience meant years of waiting for science to catch up. In court, patience meant procedure. It meant allowing each step to happen in the right order. It meant not confusing an arrest with a conviction. It meant letting the evidence be tested in the open system the law requires. For families, that can be difficult. The arrest may feel like an answer, but the court still has to speak. Until it does, the case remains in a suspended place. There is a name now, but not yet a final judgment. That suspended place lasted until the next major legal development. In January of 2019, Raymond Roe appeared in Lancaster County Court and pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Christy Mirack. With that plea, the long unsolved case moved into a new category. It was no longer only solved by investigators. It was answered in court. The guilty plea avoided a trial. That meant the evidence did not have to be presented over days or weeks before a jury. It also meant that Christy's family and the community did not have to listen to every detail be unfolded in that setting. For some people, a plea can be a mercy. For others, it can leave questions unasked. Both feelings can exist at the same time. The court sentenced Roe to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Reports also described additional sentencing connected to other charges. But the central result was plain. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. A legal sentence is official language. It is not emotional language. It gives the state's answer to the crime. It says what will happen next in the narrow terms the law can command. But it does not tell the whole human story. It cannot. A sentence cannot give back the years. It cannot return a teacher to her classroom. It cannot undo the uncertainty that stretched across more than 2 decades. It can only mark that the court has reached its finding, and that the open legal question has been resolved. Still, that matters. It matters because unanswered cases leave families in a particular kind of waiting. It matters because a community carries unfinished stories differently than finished ones. It matters because investigators who worked the case across many years finally saw the file reach a formal result. If you imagine the courtroom that day, it is not necessary to make it dramatic. There are benches, there are papers, there are attorneys, there is a judge, there are family members and reporters. There is the quiet weight of a case that began before some people in the room were born. The language in court would have been controlled. Charges, plea, sentence, rights, record. But beneath those words, there were decades. There was the school morning, there were the first calls, there were old interviews, there were lab tests that once could not answer enough. There were detectives who had retired, moved on, or handed the file to someone else. There were family members who had waited through holidays, anniversaries, and ordinary days. A court proceeding compresses all of that into hours. That compression can feel strange. A life, a loss, an investigation, and 26 years of uncertainty become a series of formal steps. Yet those steps are how the public record changes. Before the plea, the case was alleged in court. After the plea, it was adjudicated. The file had crossed another line. For the investigators, that line mattered deeply. Cold case detectives often work without knowing whether they will ever see a courtroom. They may spend months reviewing a file and find nothing new. They may send evidence for testing and receive results that do not help. They may locate a witness only to learn that memory has faded too far. They may follow a lead that feels promising and then watch it disappear. So when a case reaches a guilty plea after decades, it carries more than legal satisfaction. It shows that patient work can matter even when the first years bring no answer. It shows that preservation can be as important as pursuit. It shows that old evidence, if cared for, may still have a future. The Mirack case became one of the early examples people cited when they talked about forensic genetic genealogy. It was not only because of the result, it was because the investigative path was so clear. A preserved DNA profile had not matched the usual database. A genealogy search led to a family line. A living person emerged as a person of interest. Discarded items gave investigators a sample. The comparison connected that person to the evidence. Then the court process confirmed the outcome. Each of those steps could be explained. That made the case a kind of teaching example. Not a simple one, not a perfect one, but a clear one. In the years after 2018, law enforcement agencies across the country studied cases like this. They asked whether their own cold case shelves contained evidence that might now be useful. They looked at old sexual assault kits, old homicide files, unidentified remains, and cases where DNA existed but no suspect had ever been named. They looked for samples preserved well enough to test. They looked for profiles strong enough to upload into genealogy systems when the rules allowed it. They looked for the same kind of opening that Lancaster County had found. The Mirack case did not create the method, but it helped show what the method could do. It showed that a case could remain unsolved for more than 25 years and still be reachable. It showed that the absence of a direct database hit did not always mean the end of DNA work. It showed that relatives, records, and patient analysis could create a new route toward an answer. That route is not fast. It may sound fast when compressed into a news article, but building a family tree can require many small confirmations. It asks, who were the shared ancestors? It asks, which branch leads to Pennsylvania? It asks, which descendants were living at the right time? It asks, who fits the age, sex, and geography? It asks, who can be excluded? Each answer removes one path or opens another. And because families are complicated, the genealogist has to be careful at every turn. A wrong marriage record can mislead. A mistaken parent can shift a tree in the wrong direction. An unrecorded adoption can change the whole pattern. A family secret can make the paper trail incomplete. That is why the work is less like a straight road and more like a slow walk through branches. You move outward, you come back. You check the trunk again, you test one path against another. You do not force the tree to say what you wanted to say. You let the records narrow the answer, if they can. In Christy Mirack's case, the records eventually narrowed the answer far enough to focus on Roe. But even then, investigators did not stop at the tree. They returned to DNA. That return is what made the case strong. It protected against the risk of treating genealogy as more certain than it was. A family tree can suggest a person. A direct sample can confirm or exclude. That is the safeguard. That is the step that turns a research lead into forensic evidence. In this case, the water bottle and gum became the bridge between those two worlds. There is something almost humble about those objects. They were not hidden away like rare evidence. They were not preserved from 1992. They came from a later day in ordinary public life. They were used, discarded, collected, and tested. For most of us, a water bottle is nothing. It is carried in a car, left on a table, dropped in a recycling bin, forgotten before the day is over. Chewing gum is even smaller. It is a passing thing. Something taken from a wrapper, used for a while, and thrown away. But biological traces do not always follow our sense of importance. They can remain on objects we think of as meaningless. They can answer questions the object itself never knew it was carrying. That is what makes the evidence feel strange. Not because it is mysterious, but because it is ordinary. The ordinary nature of the evidence also reminds us that investigations are often built from things people overlook. A receipt, a phone record, a calendar entry, a handwritten note, a fiber, a bottle, a piece of gum, a name in an old directory, a cousin match in a database. None of these things feels like the center of a life. but when placed carefully in context, they can become the center of a case. The meaning comes from connection. One item connects to one fact. That fact connects to another. Eventually, the chain becomes strong enough to carry the truth. In the Mirack case, the chain crossed time. The evidence from 1992 could not finish the work at first. The discarded items from 2018 could not mean anything without the old profile. The genealogy could not stand without comparison. The court could not sentence without the investigative chain. Each moment needed the others. That is one reason the case feels so suited to a quiet retelling. It is not a story of one sudden discovery. It is a story of accumulation. It is a story of evidence gaining meaning as the world changed around it. It is a story of people returning to what remained, and what remained, first of all, was Christy's name. In legal documents, a victim's name can appear many times. It appears in charges. It appears in affidavits. It appears in hearing records. It appears in sentencing documents. The repetition is formal, but it also has a human force. The name keeps the case from becoming abstract. Christy Mirack was 25 years old. She taught 6th grade. She was expected at school that morning. People noticed because she mattered in a daily way. That simple fact was the first alarm. Not technology, not genealogy, not DNA, just the absence of someone dependable. It is easy in hindsight to focus on the scientific ending. But the case began with people paying attention, a colleague's concern, a principal's check, a call to police, an early decision to treat the scene carefully, a decision to preserve evidence. Those human steps came before the advanced tools. Without them, there would have been no sample to test. Without the sample, no profile. Without the profile, no genealogy. Without genealogy, no water bottle. Without the water bottle, no direct comparison. The entire later case rested on early care. That is why old investigations ask us to respect the first hours. The first hours are imperfect. They are emotional. They are confusing. People do not yet know what will matter, but those hours can shape everything that comes after. In 1992, the investigators did not have a genealogy option. They did not have the same DNA tools later labs would use. They did not have the same databases. They did not have the same public awareness of forensic preservation. But they did know enough to collect and protect what seemed important. That was the beginning of the answer, even though no one could see it. There is a kind of faith in evidence preservation, not religious faith, necessarily. A practical faith. A belief that the future may be able to do more than the present. A belief that careful work now may help someone later. A belief that an unanswered case deserves that chance. The Mirack case rewards that kind of faith. It does not do so quickly. It takes more than 2 decades. It takes new science, new databases, and new legal understanding. It takes many people who were not there on the first day, but the early choice remains at the center. Keep what may matter. For families in cold cases, those choices are often invisible at the time. They may not know which items were preserved. They may not know which tests were run. They may not know how many times a detective reviewed the file. They may simply live with the fact that there is no answer yet. That is a hard way to live. An unsolved case creates a kind of unfinished room in the mind. You can walk away from it. You can close the door for a while. But the room is still there. At anniversaries, at holidays, at quiet moments, it may open again. When the answer comes years later, it does not erase that room. It changes it. It puts a name on one wall. It places a court document on the table. It allows the family to say, the state has answered what it can answer. But the room remains connected to the person who was lost. That is why legal closure and emotional closure are not the same. Legal closure can happen on a date. A plea is entered, a sentence is imposed, a docket changes. Emotional closure, if it comes at all, moves differently. It may arrive in pieces. It may never feel complete. In the Mirack case, the court answered who? It answered the criminal responsibility. It did not answer every private question people may have carried. Why Christy? Why that morning? What was missed? Could anything have been different? Some of those questions may never have satisfying answers. The law can prove certain facts. Science can identify a profile. Genealogy can locate a family line. But motive, memory, and private moments, are not always fully recoverable. And after the plea, the unanswered parts did not simply disappear. They became quieter, and they moved into a different part of the story. The official record could now name Raymond Rowe as the person responsible in court. It could record the guilty plea, the sentence, and the investigative steps that led there. But it could not fully describe what the answer felt like after so much time. That feeling belonged to the people who had waited. For Christy's family, the court date was not just a legal event. It was a return to the first winter of the case, and to every year after it. The case had been public, but grief had also been private. That is one of the quiet tensions in a long investigation. A family may want answers from the system while also wishing the person they love was not known to strangers through a file. In court, family members had the chance to speak about Christy. Those statements matter because they restore the person to the center of the record. They remind the room that the evidence, the genealogy, and the sentence all point back to a life. The state can speak in legal terms, but families speak in human terms. They remember personality. They remember laughter. They remember daily kindness. They remember all the ordinary things the court cannot measure. That is especially true when the person lost was a teacher. Teaching is built from small acts repeated over time. A teacher prepares lessons, writes notes, answers questions, watches students change, and carries concern for children who may never know how much they were seen. Those acts do not appear in police reports, but they are part of the reason people remembered Christy for so long. A classroom holds a particular kind of memory. It remembers in rows of desks, in bulletin boards, in names written on folders, and in the routines that make children feel the day has a shape. When a teacher is gone suddenly, the room does not know what to do with itself. The plans remain, the books remain. The students arrive with their ordinary questions, and the adults around them have to carry something very difficult. Gently, Rorastown Elementary became part of the Mirack story because Christy did not arrive there. That simple absence started the chain. The school's concern was not technical, and it was not forensic. It was human attention. Someone dependable was missing, and other people noticed quickly. Years later, when the case was solved, that beginning still mattered. The final answer had come through advanced science, but the first alarm came through ordinary care. A principal checking on a teacher, colleagues refusing to ignore an absence, a community understanding that something was wrong because the pattern of a life had broken. In cold cases, we often focus on the final tool, the new test, the genealogy database, the lab report, the discarded item. But the first tool is sometimes simple attention. Someone notices, someone calls, someone writes the first note, someone preserves what might matter. That sequence is easy to overlook because it feels so practical. But practical choices become history in an old case. A phone call becomes a timeline. A welfare check becomes a scene response. A collected sample becomes a profile. A sealed envelope becomes a future answer. By the time Rowe entered his guilty plea, all those early choices were visible in retrospect. The file could be read backward now. The ending gave meaning to decisions made long before anyone knew they would matter. That is one of the strange gifts of solved cold cases. They allow us to see the usefulness of patience after the fact. At the time, patience may feel like delay. It may feel like nothing happening. It may feel like a family being asked to endure another month and then another year. But in the record, patience can become the space where evidence survives. It can become the space where science changes. It can become the space where a later investigator finds a new way through. The Mirack case shows this clearly because the central evidence waited for the world to change around it. In 1992, the biological material could identify only in limited ways. It could compare, but it could not search family trees. It could help rule people out, but it could not reach toward a distant cousin in a public genealogy system. So the evidence remained powerful but unfinished. That unfinished quality followed the case for years. It was not a lack of importance, it was a lack of method. The evidence had more to say than the available tools could hear. When you think about an old evidence room, it may help to imagine time moving differently there. Outside, years pass with weather, school terms, elections, new buildings and children growing into adults. Inside, a sealed item remains in place. Its label may fade slightly. Its packaging may look older. But if the chain of custody holds, it still belongs to the same question. That is why an evidence room can feel like a quiet archive of unfinished promises. Each stored item says, someone thought this might matter. Each label says, this was kept for a reason. Each log entry says, the path is still traceable. In the Mirack case, that traceability became essential. The court did not need only the fact that DNA existed. It needed to know where it came from. It needed to know how it was collected. It needed to know how it was stored, tested, retested, and compared. A sample without a trustworthy history is fragile in court. A sample with a clear history can carry weight across decades. That is why the people who manage evidence deserve a place in the story. They are rarely the names remembered in headlines. They may not attend press conferences. They may never meet the family. But their work allows future science to mean something. They check seals. They record transfers. They keep shelves organized. They make sure that an item removed for testing is returned properly or documented if consumed by testing. They preserve the chain that later detectives and prosecutors must rely on. In a case that takes more than 25 years, those quiet tasks are not minor. They are the difference between a clue and a usable clue. They are the difference between suspicion and proof. The same is true of the laboratory work. A lab report is often a plain document. It may not sound moving when read aloud. It may contain technical language, allele numbers, statistical calculations, and statements of comparison. But behind that plainness is care. The lab has to separate possibility from certainty. It has to describe limitations. It has to avoid saying more than the science supports. It has to translate a biological trace into a statement the legal system can understand. In the Mirack case, that work happened in stages. The original evidence was collected when testing was younger. Later testing developed a clearer profile. Then the genealogy process required a form of genetic data that could be compared beyond the standard law enforcement database. Finally, the discarded items connected to Roe allowed a direct comparison. Each stage answered a different question. What can be recovered? Who can be excluded? What family line may be involved? Does this specific person match the preserved profile? When described slowly, the case becomes less like a single breakthrough and more like a relay. One generation of investigators carried the evidence as far as their tools allowed. Another generation received it. The lab carried it into a clearer profile. The genealogists carried it into family research. The detectives carried it into surveillance and sample collection. The prosecutors carried it into court. No one step held the whole answer by itself. That is an important comfort, in a way. It reminds us that justice in old cases is often shared work. It does not depend on one person being brilliant in a single moment. It depends on many people being careful over a long time. The public sometimes loves the language of genius. One detective, one clue, one sudden insight. But old casework is usually quieter than that. It is a chain of diligence. It is a file that keeps being opened. It is a question that keeps being asked correctly. After Roe's guilty plea, many people looked back at the genealogy stage with renewed attention. They wanted to know how a family tree could lead to a man who had not been named for so many years. They wanted to understand how distant relatives could become part of a criminal investigation. They wanted to know what made this method different from earlier DNA searches. The difference begins with the database itself. Traditional law enforcement DNA databases compare forensic profiles to profiles collected under specific legal rules. Those profiles often come from people convicted of certain crimes, arrested in certain jurisdictions, or otherwise included under statute. If the unknown person is not in that database, there may be no direct hit. Forensic genetic genealogy asks a broader kinship question. It does not need the unknown person to be in the database. It needs relatives to be present. Even distant relatives can help, if the genetic relationship is strong enough and the records can be followed. That is what made the method so different. It turned a missing direct match into a search through family connections. But family connections are not simple. Every person has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and the numbers expand as the tree moves backward. Each generation adds names, places, marriages, children, and migrations. A single third cousin match may point toward a pair of shared great-great-grandparents. From there, a genealogist may need to build many descendant lines forward. Some lines will be too old, some will be too young, some will be in the wrong place. Some will lead to women when the forensic profile indicates a male. Some will have no connection to Lancaster County. Slowly, the broad tree narrows. This narrowing is not guesswork when it is done well. It is structured research. It uses documents. It uses inheritance patterns. It uses geography. It uses time. It uses the known facts of the case, but it does not let those facts force the answer. You can picture the genealogist with several windows open on a screen. One window holds the match list. Another holds a public family tree. Another holds an obituary naming children and grandchildren. Another holds a census record or a marriage index. Another holds a map, a surname appears. Then it appears again. A county connects to another county. A maiden name explains a branch that first seemed unrelated. A birth date places someone in the right generation. A residential history brings a person closer to Lancaster County. None of these moments is dramatic by itself, but each one reduces the uncertainty a little. That is the rhythm. A little less uncertainty, then another little piece, then another. Eventually, if the records cooperate, the family tree begins to point, not accuse, point. That difference must be kept clear. In the Mirack case, that pointing became focused enough for investigators to look at Raymond Rowe. He was not identified by a simple database hit. He emerged from the narrowing process. That made the next step essential. A direct sample had to confirm whether the tree had led to the right person. This is where the water bottle and chewing gum entered the record. They were not glamorous evidence. They were practical evidence. They were objects that could carry Rowe's DNA without requiring him to know that investigators were collecting it. Reports described investigators obtaining discarded items connected to Rowe, including a water bottle and gum. The items were collected after genealogy had already made him a person of interest. Then they were sent for comparison testing. The ordinariness of that collection is part of why the case stayed in public memory. People understood the bottle. They understood the gum. They understood how easily a person could leave such things behind. But the legal and forensic meaning was more complex. A discarded item can be useful only if investigators can connect it reliably to the person of interest. They have to know who used it. They have to document where it was found. They have to preserve it without contamination. They have to send it through proper channels. The lab then has to determine whether a profile can be developed from the item. A water bottle may contain useful cells around the rim. Chewing gum may contain saliva. But neither item guarantees a clean result. There can be mixtures, there can be too little material, there can be handling by other people, there can be environmental issues. That is why the lab must test, evaluate, and report carefully. In this case, the comparison was strong enough for investigators to move forward. The discarded items linked Rowe directly to the unknown profile that had waited since 1992. Once that happened, the role of genealogy changed again. Before the comparison, genealogy was the path to a lead. After the comparison, it became part of the story of how investigators found the person to test. The direct DNA result carried the central forensic weight. That distinction became important for prosecutors. They did not need to prove that a family tree alone identified Rowe. They needed to show that the old evidence matched the sample associated with him. The genealogy explained how detectives arrived at him. The comparison explained why the case could be charged. A good investigation keeps those layers separate. It does not blur the lead with the proof. It does not let a promising direction become a conclusion too soon. That caution protects the case, and it protects people who might otherwise be wrongly pulled into suspicion. The ethical questions around genealogy are not side issues. They are part of the method's future. When a person uploads genetic data to learn about ancestry, they may not expect that data to help identify a distant relative in a criminal investigation. Some people welcome that possibility. Others are uneasy. Many hold both feelings at once. They may want violent cold cases solved. They may also worry about privacy. They may support families receiving answers. They may also wonder who controls genetic information once it enters a database. The Mirack case became part of that larger conversation because it showed the method working. It showed the real human value of a decades-old answer. It also showed why clear rules would be needed as the method expanded. Consent is one of the central questions. If one person shares their own genetic data, they also reveal something about relatives who did not choose to share. Not everything, but enough to create links. Those relatives may include people they know and people they have never met. Family trees are shared by nature. A genetic match is not only individual, it is relational. It says something about ancestry, kinship, and biological connection. That makes genealogy powerful, but it also makes it sensitive. Investigators using the method must treat those family connections with care. A cousin match is not a suspect. A family branch is not a circle of guilt. A relative in a database may simply be a person who wanted to learn where their ancestors lived. In the Mirack investigation, the genealogy work led toward a person who could then be tested directly. That is the method at its strongest. It uses relatives to find direction, but it requires individual comparison before moving to accusation. Without that final comparison, the lead remains incomplete. This is why many policies around forensic genealogy emphasize confirmation. A genealogy lead should not be the sole basis for final action. It should be followed by traditional investigation, direct DNA testing, and legal review. The Mirack case followed that broad pattern. A family tree opened the search, a discarded sample tested the lead. A court process resolved the case. It is a careful sequence, and careful sequences are what old cases need. There is also the question of which cases should use such methods. Forensic genetic genealogy requires resources. It requires specialized skill. It may involve sensitive data. Many agencies reserve it for serious violent crimes or unidentified remains where the public interest is strongest. The Mirack case fit that category. It was a long unsolved homicide. The evidence was suitable. Traditional searching had not identified the unknown profile. There was a clear investigative need that does not remove every ethical concern, but it explains why investigators turned to the method. They had a case that had waited more than 25 years, and they had evidence that could finally be used in a new way. As more cases began using genealogy, the field also changed quickly. Databases adjusted their terms. Some users opted in for law enforcement matching, some opted out. Courts and lawmakers began considering how the method should be governed. Laboratories and genealogy companies developed standards. The early years of the method were filled with both hope and adjustment. Cold cases were being solved. Unknown people were being identified. Families were receiving answers. At the same time, the rules were still catching up. The Mirack case belongs to that early period. It stands near the beginning of a shift in forensic history. A shift from asking whether an unknown profile was already in a criminal database to asking whether family records could point toward the source. For listeners who enjoy patient detective work, that shift is worth lingering over. It did not replace old investigation. It added another layer. Detectives still needed timelines, interviews, warrants, evidence logs, and court-ready proof. Genealogists still needed documents. Labs still needed clean samples. And prosecutors still needed a story of evidence that a court could follow, step by careful step. That story began long before Raymond Rowe's name entered the file, which made the documentation essential. The old sample had to be tied to the original investigation, not only by memory, but by records. The later sample had to be tied to Rowe, not only by assumption, but by observation and procedure. Between those 2 points, the state had to show a clean path. It had to show how a case from 1992 reached a courtroom in 2019 without losing its evidentiary thread. That is a quiet kind of storytelling, but it matters very much. In court, a case is not solved because the ending feels right. It is solved because the pieces can be examined, challenged, and still hold together. So the Mirack case became a lesson in sequence. First, there was the original evidence. Then, there was preservation. Then, there was improved testing. Then there was the unnamed profile. Then there was the genealogy lead. Then there was the discarded water bottle and gum. Then there was comparison. Then there was arrest. Then there was plea. Each step had its place. Each step depended on the one before it. And if you sit with the file long enough, you begin to see how fragile that chain could have been. A missing label could have caused doubt. A broken seal could have caused doubt. An unclear collection note could have caused doubt. A rushed genealogy conclusion could have caused doubt. A poorly documented discarded sample could have caused doubt. But the case moved forward because the chain was strong enough to carry the weight placed on it. That is not a dramatic idea. It is a practical one. But in old cases, practical things are often what matter most. The people who solve cold cases do not only look for clues, they protect the meaning of clues. They keep one fact connected to the next. They make sure that when a lab result appears, it can be trusted within the larger record. That is what allowed the strange evidence in the Mirack case to become meaningful. The water bottle was not meaningful alone. The gum was not meaningful alone. The genealogy chart was not meaningful alone. The 1992 evidence was not complete alone. Together, they formed a path. And that path reached a court. By the time Rowe pleaded guilty, the public version of the case had become shorter than the real one. Most people remembered the broad outline. Teacher killed in 1992. Case unsolved for more than 25 years. Genetic genealogy points to a local DJ. Discarded items confirm the DNA. Guilty plea in 2019. Those sentences are true, but they are only the surface. Under them are years of work that do not fit easily into a headline. There were old interviews. There were evidence logs. There were reports from different eras of forensic science. There were detectives returning to names that had already been checked. There were people asking whether newer tools could make an old sample useful again. There were family members waiting through every quiet year. The full story is not only about the moment the answer came, it is about everything that kept the answer possible. That is why the Mirack case is often remembered with unusual tenderness by people who study cold cases. It does not offer a clever riddle, it offers a record of patience. It shows what happens when a case is not allowed to disappear. It shows what happens when evidence is treated as something that may outlive the limits of its own time. In that sense, the case belongs to a larger history. Across the United States, many old investigations have turned on the same basic principle. An item collected years ago becomes newly readable. A sample once too small becomes usable. A profile once trapped in a database with no match becomes searchable through kinship. A name that no one had considered emerges from a family tree. Then, as in the Mirack case, investigators must step back into ordinary police work. They must confirm. They must document. They must compare. They must prepare for court. The new science opens the door, but it does not walk through alone. That is one of the most important lessons. Technology can create a lead. People have to handle it wisely. They have to understand what the technology can say and what it cannot say. They have to know the difference between probability and proof. They have to protect the innocent branches of a family tree from becoming public suspicion. They have to remember that every genetic clue touches real people, not just the person being investigated. Relatives, parents, cousins. People whose names may appear in research notes only because they share an ancestor. This is why forensic genealogy is such a powerful and delicate tool. It can answer questions that seemed almost beyond reach. It can also bring private family information into the edge of a public investigation. A careful agency treats that edge with restraint. It limits exposure. It confirms before accusing. It keeps records secure. It explains the method without turning family members into characters in a story they did not choose. In the Mirack investigation, the public attention focused mainly on Rowe, the DNA, and the unusual discarded items. But behind the scenes, the genealogy work would have touched a wider web. That web was necessary to understand the unknown profile. It was also sensitive. The people in that web were not responsible for what happened to Christy. They were part of the method because biology connects families across distance and time. That is a sober thing to remember. A distant cousin's decision to explore ancestry can one day help solve a case. It can also reveal how closely our private histories are tied to others. The law has continued to wrestle with that reality. Agencies have developed policies. Databases have changed access rules. Some platforms require users to opt in for law enforcement matching. Others restrict the kinds of cases that may be searched. These changes reflect the same balance that the Mirack case asks us to consider. There is the need for answers. There is the need for privacy. There is the need for justice. There is the need for restraint. None of these needs is imaginary. They all belong in the room. And in the calmest version of the conversation, they do not have to shout over one another. They can be held together carefully. For Christy Mirack's family, though, the method's importance was not abstract. It brought a name after decades. It brought a guilty plea. It brought a sentence. It brought the state's answer to a question that had remained open since that cold December morning. That result is real. It is not made less real by ethical complexity. At the same time, the ethical complexity is not erased by the result. Both truths remain. This is often the way with old cases. They do not become simple when solved. They become answerable in one central way, while still carrying many layers. There is the legal layer, there is the scientific layer, there is the investigative layer, there is the family layer, there is the community layer, there is the memory layer. Each layer has its own kind of truth. The court can say who was legally responsible. The lab can say whose profile matched the preserved evidence. The genealogist can explain how family lines led toward a person of interest. The investigator can explain how the discarded items were collected. The family can explain who Christy was beyond every document. The community can explain why her absence was remembered. Together, those layers make the case more human than any single report could. They also show why cold casework asks for so much patience from everyone involved. A scientist must be patient with the limits of a sample. A genealogist must be patient with imperfect records. A detective must be patient with leads that narrow slowly. A prosecutor must be patient with the structure of proof. A family must be patient in a way no one should have to be. And the public, if it wants to understand, must be patient with the fact that justice may take a very long time. The Mirack case asks us to slow down enough to see that. It asks us not to rush to the bottle and the gum as if they were magic objects. They were not magic. They were useful because of everything around them. They were useful because the old DNA profile existed. They were useful because genealogy had narrowed the search. They were useful because investigators documented their connection to Roe. They were useful because forensic testing could compare them to the preserved evidence. Their strangeness comes from their ordinariness. Their power comes from context. That is a quiet but important distinction. A water bottle can sit in a trash bin and mean nothing. A water bottle collected at the right time for the right reason through the right procedure can help close a decades-old case. A piece of gum can be forgotten in minutes. A piece of gum tested against an old profile can become a link across 26 years. That is not because the objects are special, it is because investigation made them legible. It taught the ordinary objects how to speak within the record. And in the Mirack case, their speech was simple. They helped say, the unknown profile has a source, that source has a name. That name can now be brought before the court. From there, the legal process did what the legal process is designed to do. It placed the evidence into formal order. It recorded the plea. It imposed the sentence. It shifted the case from unsolved to solved in the eyes of the law. But even after that, the file did not lose its importance. Solved cases still teach. They show what worked. They show what could be improved. They show how old evidence may be handled in future investigations. They show how families experience delayed answers. They show how communities remember. The Mirack case became part of training, discussion, and public understanding because it was so clear in its cause and effect. Preserve the evidence. Develop the profile. Search when the tools improve. Use genealogy carefully. Confirm directly. Bring the case to court. That sequence has since appeared in many other investigations, with different facts and different people. But the Mirack case remains one of the early examples that helped the wider public understand the pattern. It gave people a concrete image, a family tree, a water bottle, a piece of gum, a case file from 1992. Those images are easier to hold than technical language. They make the science visible without turning it into a spectacle. They let people understand that a cold case can move because of something small. Not small in importance, small in size, small in daily attention, small enough to be thrown away. There is something fitting about that, in a difficult way. Christie's absence was first noticed through ordinary routine. She did not arrive at school. People who expected her noticed. The case was finally confirmed through ordinary objects, a bottle and gum, used and discarded. At both ends of the story, ordinary life became the place where the truth appeared. That does not make the story gentle in itself, but it gives it a human shape. The beginning was a school morning. The ending moved through a court. Between them were objects, records, people, and time. Lots of time. Time is the element that runs through every part of the Mirack case. In 1992, time worked against investigators in some ways. Memories could fade. Leads could cool. The unknown person could continue living without being named. But time also allowed science to grow. It allowed DNA testing to become more sensitive. It allowed databases to expand. It allowed genealogy research to move online. It allowed public records to become searchable in ways that earlier investigators could not have imagined. Time, in other words, was not only loss, it was also development. That is one of the quiet paradoxes of cold cases. The years can make some things harder. They can also make other things possible. A witness may forget a face. A sample may become easier to analyze. A suspect may move away. A database may gain a distant cousin. A detective may retire. A new investigator may read the file with fresh eyes. Nothing stays the same. Even a stored evidence package exists inside a changing world. That changing world finally caught up with the Mirack evidence. By 2018, the question that had waited for so long could be asked differently. Not simply, does this profile match someone already in a law enforcement database? But, does this profile share ancestry with someone who has made genetic information available? And if so, can records guide us toward the source? That shift opened a new investigative landscape. It was not a shortcut. It was a new road, and like any road, it required careful travel. A careless traveler could go wrong. A patient one could make progress. The genealogists and investigators in the Mirack case moved carefully enough to find a possible direction. Then they moved carefully enough to test it. That testing, through the discarded items, is what brought the old evidence into the present. There is a quiet image there, if you sit with it. A sealed sample from Christie's townhouse, held since 1992. A water bottle used in 2018. A piece of gum from the same modern world of phones, databases, and online records. The old and the new meet in a laboratory, not in a dramatic room, not with music rising, just in the plain work of comparison. A profile beside a profile, a question beside an answer. That is where much of modern cold case work truly happens, not in the public announcement, but before it, in rooms where people check, record, repeat, and verify. The result may later feel sudden to the public, but it was built in quiet. When the comparison came back, it did more than identify a suspect. It validated years of preservation. It showed that the old sample had survived well enough to matter. It showed that the chain of custody had been meaningful. It showed that the genealogy lead had pointed in the right direction. It gave investigators the confidence to proceed. It gave prosecutors a central piece of proof. It gave the family an answer they had waited far too long to hear. Still, even that answer carried questions no lab could resolve. Why did Rowe come into Christie's life in that way? Did he know her? Did they cross paths before that morning? What was the exact sequence of contact? What did anyone miss? Some reports and court records addressed parts of the case, but the deepest private questions are often difficult to recover after decades. A guilty plea can answer responsibility without explaining every motive. That is not uncommon. Many solved cases still contain a quiet center that remains partially unknown. The law can establish guilt. It cannot always reconstruct the interior of a person's mind. It cannot return every minute. It cannot make every witness remember more than they do. It cannot erase the distance created by time. This is why the word solved can be both true and incomplete. The Mirack case is solved in the legal sense. Raymond Rowe pleaded guilty. He received a life sentence without parole. The state's central question was answered, but the human mind often keeps asking smaller questions afterward. Those questions may not change the legal outcome. They may not be answerable, but they are part of the aftermath. And a calm retelling has to leave room for them. not to create suspense, not to reopen what the court has closed, only to acknowledge that legal truth and human understanding are not always the same size. The court record is formal. Human grief is not. The court record has dates. Human memory has seasons. The court record can say January of 2019. A family may remember December every year. The court record can say life without parole. A former student may remember a teacher's face. The court record can describe evidence. A colleague may remember an empty classroom. Both records matter. One belongs to the law, the other belongs to life. The Mirack case sits at the meeting point of those records. It is forensic and personal, technical and local, modern and old. It begins before the internet became part of daily life. It ends in an era when online genealogy could help identify an unknown profile. It stretches across a transformation in how people understand DNA. In 1992, DNA evidence was already important, but still limited in reach. By 2018, DNA could be a door into public family trees. That change is enormous. It is also easy to misunderstand. Forensic genetic genealogy is not the same as a simple ancestry search. It involves specialized lab processing, data interpretation, genealogical research, investigative review, and legal confirmation. It does not produce a suspect by pressing one button. It produces possibilities that must be narrowed. The narrowing may take days, weeks, or longer. It depends on the quality of the DNA profile. It depends on the number and closeness of genetic matches. It depends on how complete the family trees are. It depends on public records. It depends on whether the unknown person's relatives have data available in the right places. Some cases produce strong matches, others produce only distant ones. Some family trees are well documented, others are tangled, private, or incomplete. Some leads narrow quickly. Others remain broad and uncertain. The Mirack case was able to move because enough pieces aligned. The evidence was usable, the profile could be analyzed. The genealogy produced a direction. The records narrowed that direction. The person of interest could be investigated, a discarded sample could be obtained. The comparison confirmed the link. That alignment should not be taken for granted. Many cold cases never receive it. Some evidence was never collected. Some evidence was lost, some samples degraded, some profiles are too partial. Some genealogy searches return no useful matches. Some family trees cannot be resolved. The Mirack case shows what is possible, but it also reminds us that possibility depends on many conditions. This makes the preservation lesson even stronger. Investigators cannot control future science. They can control how carefully they collect and store evidence now. They cannot know which sample will matter later. They can avoid assuming that a sample is useless because today's tools are limited. They cannot guarantee a future answer. They can leave the future a chance. That chance became real in Lancaster County. And because it became real, other agencies could look at their own cold case evidence with renewed seriousness. They could ask whether a sealed item from the 1980s or 1990s might still hold value. They could ask whether an unknown profile could be re-examined. They could ask whether a family tree might offer a route where standard databases had failed. That ripple effect is part of the Mirack case's legacy. It also belongs to the quieter history of people who learned, from cases like this one, that old evidence should not be treated as old news. A sealed package from another decade may still be waiting for the right question. A lab report that once ended with no match may not be the end of the line. A name that never appeared in the early file may still be reachable through records no one had imagined using. That was one of the lasting changes after 2018. Cold case shelves began to look different, not because every file suddenly had an answer, but because some files now had a new path. Investigators could open a box, read an old evidence list, and ask whether the sample inside had been waiting for a tool that had finally arrived. That question was simple. It was also powerful. In Lancaster County, the Mirack case became part of the public proof that the method could work. It showed that genetic genealogy was not only a theory discussed at conferences. It could take an unknown profile from a preserved sample, move through family records, and lead detectives toward a person they could test directly. Then the direct comparison could bring the case into court. That cause and effect mattered. It made the process understandable. It also made the process harder to ignore. For cold case detectives elsewhere, the lesson was practical. Look again. Check what still exists. Ask what can be tested now. Ask whether a profile is strong enough for a new kind of search. Ask whether the old file contains enough context to support the next step. These are patient questions. They do not promise answers, but they create the conditions where answers can appear. The Mirack case also reminded agencies that preservation is not only about the past, it is a decision made for the future. When evidence is collected, no one knows what science will look like in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years. No one knows what a later lab may be able to recover. No one knows what a later database may contain. So the safest course is care. Care in collection, care in packaging, care in storage, care in notes, care in every small link of the chain. That care can feel ordinary while it is happening. A label is written, a form is signed, a package is sealed, a log is updated. Nothing about that moment announces itself as historic. But years later, when a sample still holds meaning, those small acts become part of the solution. They become visible only after the answer arrives. That is one of the quiet truths inside this case. The work that solved it began long before anyone knew it was solving anything. There is another legacy here too, and it is more complicated. Forensic genetic genealogy asks society to think carefully about how much power should come from shared family information. It asks who may search. It asks which cases justify the search. It asks what consent should mean when one person's genetic data also points toward relatives. It asks how to protect the privacy of people who are only related, not involved. Those questions did not end with the Mirack case. They grew larger after it, and yet the human value of the answer cannot be dismissed. Christy Mirack's family had waited since the 21st of December, 1992. Her colleagues had carried the memory of a teacher who did not arrive. Her students grew into adults with a name from childhood that still carried sadness. Investigators had kept a file open through years when no final answer came. When genetic genealogy helped identify Roe, it did what the method is meant to do at its best. It brought a long-hidden name into the light of proof. So the ethical question is not simple approval or simple rejection. It is balance. Use the method carefully. Use it for serious cases. Confirm every lead with direct evidence. Protect uninvolved relatives. Keep the process reviewable. Do not let a family tree become an accusation. Do not let urgency outrun proof. The Mirack case sits inside that balance. It shows the good the method can do. It also reminds us why the method needs rules. This is where the story becomes less about one courtroom and more about the future of old files. Every solved case changes how investigators look at unsolved ones. A case like this teaches them to ask whether a forgotten item may not be forgotten at all. It teaches them to see a cold case as unfinished, rather than inactive. It teaches them that time can close some doors while opening others. That is a strange comfort. Not a cheerful comfort, but a real one. Time took much from the Mirack investigation. It took immediacy. It took fresh memories. It took the first certainty people hoped for in 1992. But time also brought better testing. It brought wider records. It brought searchable family trees. It brought investigators into an era where an unknown profile could be followed through kinship. The same years that made the case colder also made the solution possible. That is one of the deep paradoxes of patient detective work. The waiting hurts. The waiting also preserves the chance for a different future. When Raymond Rowe pleaded guilty in Lancaster County Court in January of 2019, that future arrived in official language. The plea answered the central question before the court. The sentence placed the outcome into the record. The case was no longer a local mystery without a named defendant. It had become a solved homicide, supported by old evidence, new science, and direct comparison. That is the legal shape of the ending. It is clear, it is formal, it is important. But the human ending is softer and less complete. Christy is still remembered as a teacher. That word carries more than a job title. It means a room full of children once expected her. It means lessons were planned. It means colleagues knew her rhythms. It means her absence was felt in the practical language of a school day. A teacher's life is made of repetition, care, and presence. That is why her absence spoke so quickly. Before the genealogy chart, there was that absence. Before the lab comparison, there was a classroom waiting. Before the court file, there were people who knew something was wrong because Christy was not where she was supposed to be. That beginning matters. It keeps the case grounded. It reminds us that the evidence, however strange, only matters because of the person it served. The water bottle and the chewing gum became famous details because they seemed almost too small to carry such weight. But they did not carry it alone. They rested on the work of many years. They rested on the preserved biological evidence from Christie's townhouse. They rested on the unknown profile that remained unmatched. They rested on a genealogy search that narrowed possibility into direction. They rested on detectives who understood that a lead needed confirmation. They rested on lab work that turned ordinary objects into usable comparison. Then, finally, they rested on a court record. If any part of that sequence had failed, the outcome could have been different. If the original evidence had been lost, there would have been no profile to compare. If the profile had been too limited, genealogy may not have helped. If the genealogy work had been misread, investigators could have moved in the wrong direction. If the discarded items had not yielded a useful profile, the lead might have remained uncertain. If the chain of custody had been weak, the evidence might have been challenged more deeply. The solution was strong because the sequence held. That is the patient architecture of the case. And so, when people ask what solved the Mirack case, there is more than one answer. DNA solved it. Preservation solved it. Genealogy solved it. A water bottle and gum helped solve it. Detectives solved it. Lab workers solved it. Time, in its difficult way, helped solve it too. No single phrase is enough. The truth is a chain. That chain begins in 1992 in East Lampeter Township. It moves through an evidence room. It moves through years of review. It moves through improved forensic testing. It moves through a family tree. It moves through discarded items collected in 2018. It moves through a laboratory comparison. It moves through an arrest. It moves through a guilty plea. Then it settles into the official record. Each link is plain. Together, they are remarkable. There is still one part the record cannot fully hold. It cannot tell us every private reason. It cannot recover every moment. It cannot answer every question a family may have asked in the dark of a long year. It cannot make the waiting shorter. It cannot make the first morning different. This is the lingering line in many solved cold cases. The law can close a file. It cannot close every human question. In the Mirack case, the deepest unanswered word may still be why. Why Christy? Why that morning? Why a life built around teaching, friendship, and family was interrupted in that way. A guilty plea can establish responsibility. A sentence can impose consequence. A lab result can identify a source. But why can remain partly out of reach. And perhaps that is where we have to be honest. Some parts of the past do not return. Still, not everything remained out of reach. The unknown profile did receive a name. The family did receive an official answer. The court did speak. The evidence did not go silent forever. That matters. It matters even if it does not heal everything. It matters because patience became action at the right moment. It matters because people kept the file from disappearing into dust. It matters because Christie's life remained important enough for others to keep asking. If you imagine the file now, after the plea, it looks different. The old reports are still there. The early photographs are still there. The evidence logs still carry their dates. The lab reports from later years now sit beside them. The genealogy work has its place. The discarded item testing has its place. The court documents have their place. The file is no longer waiting for a name in the same way. It has one. But a file is not a life. It is only a record made after life has been disrupted. The life itself remains larger than any folder. Christy Mirack remains more than the case that bears her name. She remains a daughter, a sister, a friend, a teacher, a person missed in ways the legal record can only gesture toward. That is how the story should finally settle. Not on the method alone, not on the unusual evidence alone, but on the person whose absence made the method necessary, The strange evidence did what strange evidence sometimes does. It reminded us that meaning can hide in small things. A bottle, a piece of gum, a sealed sample, a cousin match, a line in a public record, a name written on a chart, a careful report, a quiet decision to look again. Small things, placed in order, can become large enough to answer a long question. That is the calm lesson left behind. Do not rush the old file. Do not assume silence means emptiness. Do not forget the evidence that cannot speak yet. Science may change. Records may open. A new method may appear. A later investigator may see what an earlier one could not. And sometimes, after many years, the small, ordinary thing finally becomes the key. The Mirack case began with a teacher missing from school on a cold December morning. It moved through more than 25 years of uncertainty. It turned on evidence collected before the tools were ready. It changed when genealogy opened a path through distant family connections. It became provable when discarded items gave investigators a direct comparison. It ended in court with a guilty plea and a life sentence. That is the arc. It is long. It is patient. It is human. And now, near the end, the story grows quieter. The file can rest differently. The evidence has spoken as much as it can. The court has answered what it can answer. The remaining questions are softer now, but they are still there. They belong to memory. They belong to the private places no investigation can fully enter. In that quiet, you can return to the first image. A December morning, a school building, a classroom waiting, people noticing because someone mattered. That is where the case truly began. Not with a headline, not with a database, with care. Years later, care took another form. A sample was preserved, a profile was kept, a file was reopened, a family tree was studied, a bottle and gum were collected, a comparison was made, a name entered the record. The long question finally received its official answer. The story does not need to become louder than that. It has carried enough weight already. The strange evidence has done its work. The old file has reached the place it waited for. And Christy Mirack's name remains at the center, not as a mystery, but as a life remembered. The case is closed in court. The lesson stays open. Preserve what matters. Return when the tools improve. Move carefully. Confirm patiently. Remember the person first. And for now, the papers can be placed back in order. The desk can grow still. The December morning can remain where it is, held in the record, answered in part, and quiet at last.